It's the mid-1990s. Half a decade ago, the Iron Curtain fell. In Eastern Europe, fledgling democracies are reopening their gates to the rest of the world. Decades of division are crumbling as the once alien world of communism is being swept away by the seemingly unstoppable forces of liberalism and democracy. Areas once inaccessible to outsiders are now open for tourism, investment, and study. One of these outsiders is a young PhD student from Belgium, Greet van de Wever. She's not a historian, she's an anthropologist from the Catholic University of Leuven. She's on her way to the region of Transylvania, located in the north and northwest of Romania, towards the border with Hungary. Greet is preparing to write a paper, one based on the experiences she's about to make, talking to people in 2 Transylvanian villages. These are ethnically mixed villages, because Transylvania is home not only to Romanians, but also to a Hungarian-speaking minority. This is the reason Greet has come. She wants to know how these 2 linguistic groups see each other. She starts with a curious question. She asks them about their history. A strange idea, perhaps. Surely there are better people suited to answer her questions about the history of Romanians, Hungarians, Transylvania, of Romanians and Hungarians in Transylvania. But Greet knows what she's doing. Over the course of her interviews, 2 stories emerge. Hungarian speakers tell of how their ancestors arrived in Transylvania more than 1,000 years ago to find it mostly uninhabited. They set down roots in the mountainous region, which at most had a few inhabitants speaking ancient Slavic languages. Their Romanian neighbors, they say, began to arrive 2 centuries later. By that time, Transylvania was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, and its Hungarian rulers chose to allow the newcomers, immigrating from the Balkan Peninsula, to settle on their lands among their Hungarian subjects. Okay. But when Greet speaks to their Romanian neighbors, they tell a completely different story. The Romanians say they are the descendants of the Dacians, an ancient tribe who lived in modern-day Romania over 2,000 years ago, and of the Romans who conquered the Dacians and made them a part of their empire, spreading their language and their culture to them. Even after the Roman Empire abandoned Dacia, the Romanians say, long after even the Roman Empire itself perished, these Daco-Romans, or Romanians, remained in their homeland. Their ancestors, in other words, have lived in Transylvania for over 2,000 years. When the Hungarians arrived, they conquered Transylvania and settled themselves next to the region's Romanian inhabitants. During these conversations, Greet realizes that both groups are entirely convinced of the truth of their version of the story, and that their 2 stories are diametrically opposed to each other. This is the reason Greet came to Transylvania. She did not come thinking of the unstoppable forces of liberalism and democracy that were sweeping across the continent. She came under the barrage of daily headlines proclaiming new tragedies in a state bordering both Hungary and Romania, a state imploding along ethnic fault lines, dragging all its inhabitants into horrific battle. Yugoslavia. Greet writes, quote, "The Romanians and the ethnic Hungarians' views of the history of Transylvania are directly opposed. Both view Transylvania as the cradle of their civilization. Moreover, for many, the question of the original inhabitants of Transylvania is inextricably linked with the historical rights to that region." End quote. Greet knows that this story she's investigating is not about a few villagers' amateur theories of history. This story isn't about the Romanian and Hungarian historians who have advanced theories remarkably similar to the ones recounted by these villagers. It isn't even just about who arrived to settle down and live in Transylvania at what time. At its core, this story is about one question. It is about one of the oldest questions humanity has asked itself. It has been asked by humans since before words were ever written down on a piece of paper, since before the first king climbed upon the first throne, since before the first crops were planted and the first houses were built. It is about the question of whose land is this land. Part 1. Transylvania. I first came across the strange historical debate about who lived in Transylvania during the Middle Ages while finishing my bachelor's degree in Dublin. I was doing a seminar on the region, and one of our classes was about what the instructor called the Daco-Roman continuity theory. The class was framed around one question: why is Transylvania's early history so hotly contested? Like every week, I set out to read the required literature before class. Immediately, the names of the texts stood out to me: Aside from the bland-sounding History of Transylvania by Romanian and Hungarian authors, there were titles called The Dangerous Game of Falsifying History and Hungarian Revisionists and Jingoists at Work. These texts were only by Romanian authors. There seemed to be a clear picture of what was going on. I started with these texts, which basically accused Hungarians of, to put it mildly, reinterpreting the historical evidence to create a narrative which gave them precedence of settlement in the Romanian province of Transylvania. Afterwards, when I read the Hungarian text, this is exactly the argument they gave. I felt pretty confident in having understood the situation. Hungarian national historians had created a version of history which gave them a historical right to a Romanian province with a Hungarian minority. I didn't know much of Transylvania's history yet. This was at the beginning of the course, but I knew that the province of Transylvania had been part of the Kingdom of Hungary before World War I, and that during World War II, under the auspices of the Nazis, the Hungarian puppet regime had been given control of part of Transylvania. The circumstance was changed as soon as the war was over. What I had in front of me seemed like an academic attempt to create the groundwork for justifying Hungarian claims to formerly Hungarian Romanian territory. Textbook irredentism. I signed on to our Zoom call. This was all taking place during a time before readily available vaccines, with confidence, only to have this confidence very soundly shattered. The lecturers, and fellow students doing their best to hold PowerPoint presentations over Zoom, zeroed in on the Daco-Roman continuity theory and began to dismantle it piece by piece. They showed how Romanian historians had willfully interpreted a narrative in which their ancestors never left Transylvania onto a historical record which was too sparse to support an argument either way. They showed how Romanian archaeologists went about their work with an agenda in mind, to prove their ancestors lived in Transylvania uninterruptedly since even before Roman times. They showed me, in other words, that my assumptions had been entirely false. Of course, they said some Hungarian historians also harbored nationalist sentiments and objectives, but, as one course mate surmised at the end of his presentation, theory should be the operative word when discussing the Daco-Roman continuity theory. Furthermore, given the lack of sources, both historical and archaeological, the opinions of those in academia are that conclusive evidence is lacking. When I signed off from that call, I was left alone in my room with my thoughts. Had I fallen for Romanian nationalist propaganda? How had that happened? I started going through my thoughts, through the underlying assumptions that had gotten me to this point. Why had I been more inclined to believe Romanian historians? Was it because I had known that Transylvania was a part of Romania, had a Romanian majority, and then when it had last been under Hungarian rule, it was during fascist times? Had perhaps the political circumstances of my time, which have seen Hungary turn from the problem child of European democracy to a conservative national authoritarian threat in the heart of the EU, influenced my expectations of what Hungarian historians would be like? Had I committed the sin of teleology, of reading history backwards, assuming that just because of what Hungarian politics is now, it has always been this way in the past? I'm supposed to be a historian. I'm supposed to be able to see through these things. I'm supposed to be better than that. But I wasn't. It's been over a year now. I've finished my bachelor's, started my master, but when given the chance to produce a podcast about a topic of my choice, I knew I had to return to Transylvania. Armed with the reading list from my Transylvania course, I prepared to re-enter the fold. But where to start? With Romanian authors who have an agenda? With Hungarian authors who may also have an agenda? Who could lay out the facts for me without trying to build a narrative to support an ideological objective? I wanted to hear an outsider's perspective, someone with no skin in the game. And that's when I came across Greet van de Wever, an outsider. Her article, it turns out, wasn't about the Daco-Roman continuity theory at all, but something about it kept me reading. It wasn't about historians in Budapest or Bucharest. It was about the people whose ancestors they were writing about. These people were living what the nationalists in the capitals were arguing about. And her findings, well, quote, "In mixed villages, the sensitive issues are not discussed in ethnically mixed groups. Virtually everything to do with history is suppressed in the day-to-day life of the village. Nevertheless, that does not stop one ethnic group from gossiping about the other. Thus, mutual distrust persists. Such a sense of fear is a dangerous breeding ground." End quote. This is what is at stake here. This is what historians play with when they engage in nationalism. People's lives. It's why I was so unsure of myself after that class, why I'm still nervous researching this topic. I don't want to get this wrong. For all the clarity of mission Great's article gave, I was still faced with my original problem. What actually happened? The problem was the bibliography I was armed with wasn't unlimited, and most of the books were written by Hungarian and Romanian authors. Where could I find a perspective outside of nationalist discourse that could contextualize what the nationalist historians were saying? Well, sometimes people are the best sources of context. I decided to email my former lecturer in Dublin for advice. But also, I had just inscribed into a seminar on Yugoslavia in my master's degree. While researching the background of the class lecturer, I found out that he had written a book on Romanian nationalists. After our class the next day, I just asked him, "Have you heard of the Daco-Roman continuity theory?" "Sadly, yes," he replied. "What you're going to want to do is check out the Handbuch zur Geschichte Südosteuropa. That's German for Handbook of Southeastern European History. That'll give you a rundown of what we actually know about the Dacians." Finally, a lead. Turns out the handbook is available online, a quick download onto my iPad and a skim through the table of contents with a digital highlighter, and I'd found the sections I was looking for. The handbook laid out the history of the Dacians, a tribe that it said occupied only parts of modern-day Romania. But that history, these sections of the book, however detailed they were, they ended with the Roman conquest of Dacia. What happened then? I still had one highlighted section left to read. I skipped forward, skimming past half the book to find the page I was looking for. And there it was. One paragraph. What happened to the Daco-Romans, the Romanians, during the Middle Ages? The paragraph mentions the Daco-Roman continuity theory, mentions in passing how they specifically see the mountainous regions of Dacia, so modern-day Transylvania, as the refuge of their ancestors during the period of the great migrations and political upheaval that followed Rome's collapse. But the paragraph also says that the first mention of the Romanians comes in the 11th century, and they've got a new name, Vlachs. Based on the Old Bulgarian word for Roman, the source describes them as shepherds who partook in an insurrection against the Byzantine Emperor Constantine X. That insurrection took place in the middle of Greece. And how did they get there? Did they leave Dacia after Rome abandoned the province, like the Hungarian historians postulated? The article doesn't say. It does, however, note a similarity in language. Romanian, while clearly based on Latin, bears a closeness to Albanian. That, so the handbook, suggests a refuge close to Albanian territory. Eastern Macedonia. That's hundreds of kilometers away from Transylvania. So the Romanians weren't in Transylvania? But the article doesn't want to commit to the theory either. Once again, it seems that conclusive evidence is lacking. Alright, okay, so perhaps we'll never know who was in Transylvania when, or who got there first, or stayed there the longest, I get it. One of the things you'll learn about history is that sometimes the answers are really just gone. This isn't a movie where you find a hidden temple or secret book that has all the answers. Sometimes they're just lost. Those mists of time you hear old-fashioned history teachers talk about are real. But even if that is the case, even if that knowledge is lost or can't be found or will never find enough knowledge to be able to say what actually happened, I can't help but come back to those villagers Great Van de Vever spoke to. They still believe in their stories. But how? Where did those stories, those histories come from? When Gred was there, she asked her hosts about their histories. The Romanians told her about their schools, and indeed secondary school students in Romanian schools are taught the Daco-Roman continuity theory in second year. The Hungarians told her a much different story. Their grandmothers and grandfathers had passed a truth down to them, a truth they weren't allowed to speak in public. They told of books, old books, kept secret, kept hidden from the police and from their Romanian neighbors, which told this truth, this version of history they considered the truth. But why? I know that Romania was an authoritarian country until 1989, but that had been a communist regime. What would their business be meddling with nationalist politics? Communists are supposed to hate that. Maybe I've been looking in the wrong place. Maybe I've been researching the wrong story. See, I thought this would be the story of figuring out what happened in Transylvania in the Middle Ages, but perhaps this story doesn't take place in the Middle Ages at all. The people who this story is about were alive in the 1990s. They're still alive today. This is their story, the story about how these theories about Daco-Roman continuity or Hungarian immigratory primogeniture came to dominate these people's understandings of who they are, and who their neighbors are, and who is right. I shouldn't be looking at the ancient past at all. This story is about those historians who made the theories these people believe. It's not about history. It's about historiography, the study of the writing of history. I need to find out more about these historians. And that's when I got a lucky break. My lecturer from Dublin replied to my email. He gave me suggestions on where to look for books about nationalist historiography. I followed them, and found two. One by a Hungarian author, one by a Romanian. The Hungarian author, Laszlo Kurdi, had written a book called The Remote Borderland, Transylvania and the Hungarian Imagination. The other, by Romanian historian Lucian Boia, was entitled History and Myth in Romanian Consciousness. Since it was the Dacians and the Romans that had brought me here, I decided to start with Boia and his account, of where the theory of where they came from came from. Boya's story starts in the early modern era. This is the first time that first outsiders and then Romanian scholars began to notice the connection of their language to Latin. In tandem with this discovery was born the question of where the Romanians came from. But what Boya's account shows is that Romanians did not always believe they were the ancestors of a Daco-Roman mixing. Given the prestige of the connection to ancient Rome and the fact of their language, the first assumption was that Romanians were of purely Roman origin, and that the Dacians had been wiped out by the invaders. In Transylvania in particular, which was at the time its own sovereign state under the rule of a caste of Hungarian aristocrats, Romanian scholars used this theory, as Boya put it, like a weapon. Quote, "As the descendants of the masters of the world, whose language was still the official language of Hungary and Transylvania, the Romanians could not go on forever accepting the supremacy of a people inferior to themselves, according to the standards of the time, in race and origin." End quote. Even then, over 200 years ago, arguments over history were being used by political activists to achieve a concrete policy objective, in this case the emancipation of ethnic Romanians in the Principality of Transylvania. It was over the course of the 19th century that this theory became more and more discredited, but it is worth pointing out that Boya shows quite starkly that when people articulated this pure Roman origin theory, they often went on to say that this gave the Romanians pure and noble blood, which sounds like racist attempt at creating an argument for biological superiority if ever I've heard any. It was only in the 1870s, so Boya, that the idea of a Daco-Roman mixture was born. That is, until it was overshadowed by theories which strongly favored highlighting Dacian continuity, going so far as to proclaim Dacian purity in the decades before and during World War II. After the war, under communist auspices, historical research shifted to view the Dacians and the Romans from the perspective of class, and more focus was laid on the role of the Slavs. The Slavs? Well, turns out there had been a significant Slavic influence on Romanian culture and language, one that had been systematically denied by nationalist Romanian scholars and institutions who sought to differentiate themselves from their Slav neighbors. But under Soviet control, Romanian textbooks now celebrated the Slavic origins of many Romanian words, and the Romanian state's foundation came to be viewed as a Slavic construct. When in its later years the Romanian communist regime turned towards promoting national values, Slavic influences were de-emphasized, while Daco-Roman influences were promoted with renewed vigor. In particular, Boya highlights how this was achieved by changing the point in history when the Romanian nation was formed. If one took this to be the 10th century, a time when many institutions had Slav origins and many Slavonic elements had been incorporated into the Romanian language, then Slavs were indeed a founding element to Romanian national identity. But if one pushed the formation of the Romanian nation back into a time before Slav elements were introduced, then they were not a founding part, but rather additions or modifications to a pre-existing identity. Boya mentions multiple different proposed periods for when this formation is supposed to have taken place, not really emphasizing any one, or appearing entirely convinced by the exercise's academic value to begin with, but that's not the point here. Remember, by now we've arrived in the 1980s. This is when the Romanian villagers Gred Vandewever spoke to would have been in school. This is when they would have learned their history. And it seems as though the Romanian government was at the time shifting towards a national-centric educational program which sought to distance Romanians from their Slav neighbors, and thus ended up pushing the creation of the Romanian nation into a period of history in which it is unclear which territory this Romanian nation occupied. As a state occupying territory, it stands to reason that it would be in the state's interest to create an argument for why it should occupy this territory, a reason which, in the form of the Daco-Roman continuity theory, ended up in these Romanian villagers' classrooms. But before we look at that theory's history, what was that Cold War-era government, and why did it distance itself from its Warsaw Pact allies? Now, to do this, we need to situate Romanian historiography in the history of the Romanian People's Republic, the communist state created after World War II. Boya suggests that communist Romania's imposed creation, having been under Soviet occupation at the time, created a need for the communist regime to justify its existence. He shows, quite convincingly I might add, that this led not just Romania, but most other Eastern European communist countries towards nationalism. Also, as living standards stagnated in communist Europe in the latter decades of its existence, nationalism provided the additional benefit of distracting the populace from its deteriorating material circumstances. The man at the head of communist Romania in these latter decades was Nicolae Ceausescu. In many ways, Ceausescu's nationalism exceeded that of his communist contemporaries. Importantly for our inquiry, Boya points out that under his rule, history became concerned with the origins of the Romanian people, in order to justify the current regime. The Dacians were now held to have occupied all of modern-day Romania, a claim dismissed by most modern archaeologists, and Ceausescu sought to associate himself with the founding Dacian king Burebista. He even held celebrations in 1980 to honor the founding of the Dacian kingdom under Burebista, a kingdom which was supposedly unitary and centralized, and led by a sole figure, a historical connection to Ceausescu's own regime his propaganda was sure to emphasize. But if Romania's communist leader was to claim the inheritance of the Dacian realm, he needed to justify this by proving continuity from that realm to his political entity, which takes us back to the Daco-Roman continuity theory. Let's return to Boia. He too first makes reference to the lack of sources for the period in question, between 271, the year of the Roman withdrawal, and the 14th century, the founding of the Romanian states of Wallachia and Moldova, but he doesn't leave it at that. He states that this paucity of sources allows for the proliferation of outlandish theories, since there is insufficient hard evidence to deny any of them. That, and, as he's quick to point out, the questions of Romanian continuity became politically loaded already in Habsburg times. Boia names the two schools of thought: the immigrationists who believe that Romanians spent some of the period in question outside of current-day Romania, that is, south of the Danube, and the, Romanian nationalists. He doesn't exactly beat around the bush here. Boia tells a story in which Romanian historians contemplate a series of different continuity theories, that Romanians lived in all of Dacia continuously, that they lived in all of Dacia but also south of the Danube, that they lived only in Transylvania, where the Carpathian Mountains protected them from outside attack. In the lead up to World War II, all of these theories cohabited in Romanian historiography. Yes, there was a gradual shift in emphasis being placed on continuity north of the Danube, but as Boia is sure to point out, all historians were willing to take areas south of the Danube into consideration as places where the Romanian people were formed. Until communism. With the imposition of the communist regime, the story now went that rather than Romanians living outside of Romania's current borders, the Slav migrations had restricted the space of Romanian-ness to within the country's current borders. After the reassertion of nationalism, the sphere of Romanian formation was limited to the country's current borders. Now, that got me thinking. Of course that makes sense. If Romanian nationalism was suppressed during the early communist years, then what if it just came back even more ferocious in the latter communist decades under Ceausescu, proclaiming continuity above all and only in its current borders? But Boia highlights a different motivation. See, one of the reasons Romanian historians had been willing to entertain areas south of the Danube as being historically Romanian was that there were people there who spoke a language very similar to Romanian, the Aromanians. And in the interwar years, Boia states the Romanian government was positioning itself as the international guarantor of the rights of Aromanians living in other countries like Greece and Yugoslavia. Ceausescu's regime, on the other hand, which sought to distance itself from interference by other communist states after its experience with the Soviet Union, could not at the same time go around interfering in the affairs of these states in the name of looking out for their Aromanians. So, as a matter of political expediency, the focus was shifted to a Romanian origin within the state's current borders. The implications of this decision are the mental constructs Gret found in the minds of the Transylvanian villagers almost a decade after Ceausescu's regime had been toppled, and the man himself had been executed. Because restricting the formation of Romanian-ness within the country's current boundaries, coupled with claims that the Dacians had populated all of current Romania in ancient times, leads to a version of history in which no significant demographic change ever took place on the territory of Romania since the very beginnings of time. Despite, that is, for the influx of Roman civilizational excellence some 2,000 years ago. And, of course, the arrival of the Hungarians. It was during the Ceausescu years that this minority suffered the most. Their autonomy was eviscerated, their schools closed, and many emigrated. All the while, Romanian schools were preaching this new version of their history to their students. Should it then be surprising that the Romanian villagers Gret spoke with saw their Hungarian neighbors as the newcomers, that they accused them of deliberately trying to distort history to serve an irredentist political agenda the Romanian villagers ascribed them as having? Should it be surprising that the ethnic slur some Romanians used to refer to Hungarians translates to "you who came"? The Hungarian Gret interviewed, by the way, also had a derogatory term that they could use against their Romanian neighbors. This slur most likely derived from the word Vlach, which, remember, was used to refer to Romanian speakers from outside of Transylvania. So in other words, both ethnic groups' means of insulting each other is based on calling the others strangers to the land they both inhabit. That also goes hand in hand with what Boia has to say about Hungarian historians. Their theory of Romanian immigration from south of the Danube, which he describes as a dogma in Hungarian historiography, serves the political objective of constructing an argument for Hungarian primogeniture in Transylvania. But all Hungarian historians? I don't know about you, but I don't like the way Boia was generalizing about Hungarians here. Was he really objective in this matter? Was there something I had missed? There was only one way to find out. Time to read the Hungarian book. Laszlo Kurti agrees with Boya that Hungary and Romania's relationship has been dominated by their historiographies, and traces the origins of this relationship to the 19th century, a time in which he observes both countries were at the margins of the emergent phenomenon of industrialization. To quote the man himself, "The economic marginalization and its resulting climate, characteristic of the turn of the century in much of Eastern Europe, did little to help Hungary and Romania solve their own problems in their relations to each other. Industrialization and the Habsburg political movement to attain hegemony over the entire area of the empire was paralleled by other factors as well. Cultural awakening, the discovering of the peasantry by the intellectuals as the, quote, only class capable of retaining cultural patterns from the past, and the search for new artistic modes of expressions were unmistakably heralding a new era in which Hungarians and Romanians were once again face to face as adversaries. With the trembling of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, nationalists tried to institute socio-political changes to promote one nationality group at the expense of the other. For example, Hungarians rejoicing in the 1867 Ausgleich, the compromise, which allowed the unification of Transylvania and Austro-Hungary, and instituted sweeping changes in the Transylvanian judiciary, administrative, and educational systems. Hungarianization was in full swing." End quote. What Kurti is referring to is the split of the Habsburgs' Austrian Empire into an Austrian and Hungarian part. As part of this compromise, Hungary was given a wide degree of control over its territories, among which Transylvania now found itself. In this period, the formerly independent principality was now administered from Budapest, the Hungarian language was promoted through the school system, and most importantly, the idea that population and territory were connected was implanted on the minds of both Hungarians and Romanians. Then came the end of World War I. Kurti highlights that this was seen as the, quote, root of all current problems, end quote. For after World War I, at the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary lost much of its territory, including Transylvania. While Hungarian quote-unquote patriots decried the quote-unquote tragedy of Trianon, Kurti says that the Romanian quote-unquote nationalists had achieved the unity of quote-unquote Greater Romania. During the interwar period, Kurti sees both countries drifting towards increased nationalism, appealing to the newly formed League of Nations to assist in their geopolitical ambitions. In Hungary's case, reclaiming its lost territory. In Romania's case, getting assurances of support for the continued existence of their state in its current form. It was then, in a Hungary still plagued with social and economic troubles, that the Hungarian elites began to become interested in Transylvanian irredentism in order to, so Kurti, distract from internal policy shortcomings. It was then that, quote, writers, historians, sociologists, and artists resorted to the most noble cause of convincing the society at large, as well as the international public, of the injustice and suffering meted out by Trianon on the Hungarian nation. End quote. World War II brought part of Transylvania back under Hungarian rule, but the status quo ante was restored as soon as the Soviet armies expelled fascist forces from the area. Now both countries were under communist rule, an ideology that supposedly would supplant nationalism in any polity that adopted it. In reality, Kurti shows that the topic remained sensitive for both governments, but that legal equality and increased autonomy for Transylvanian Hungarians, instituted after World War II, helped in alleviating some of the tensions. That legal autonomy, however, was not to last. As Ceausescu's regime was turning more and more towards nationalism, the rights of ethnic Hungarians were more and more curtailed. Their autonomy was restricted and later wholly abolished, as were Hungarian language schools. Kurti explained that it was in this climate, one of increased restrictions on the Hungarian minorities' rights, that the debate on the Romanian national origins and continuity was taken up anew by Hungarian historians. But before embarking on this story, Kurti clarifies another point. For Hungarian nationalist historians, Transylvania was not just a territory settled by Hungarians. It was the first area settled by Hungarians when they emigrated from Asia into Europe in the Middle Ages. It was seen as the area where their national identity was formed. This was, by the way, the same story told to Gret by the Hungarian villagers she met. Transylvania was the location of their ethnogenesis, a role which, it appears, the region plays for not just one nation. Kurti explains that the scholarly debate got started in earnest upon the publication by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences of a 3-volume work called History of Transylvania. And that's the book I read in the class way back when I first encountered this story. That's the book where I first heard the story that Romanians had come to Transylvania after the Hungarians. Published in 1986 and approved by the Hungarian communist regime, the book flew off the shelves in Hungary. The reaction to the Hungarian 3-parter was quick. Romanian historians attacked it in newspapers and magazines around the world, and in books. It was in the aftermath of History of Transylvania's release that the Romanian books I had read way back when from my Transylvania class were penned. Stefan Pascu's The Dangerous Game of Falsifying History was published in 1987. That, then, was the knowledge which the villagers in Transylvania had inherited by the time Gret visited them in the mid-1990s. But if you've been paying close attention, you'll have noticed that I've been taking what Kurti is saying with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily what he's saying, but how he's saying it, how he's contextualizing it, calling Hungarians patriots and Romanians nationalists while describing the same kind of people. Sure, he put the noble cause that Hungarian nationalists followed post-Pranon in quotation marks, but he also keeps referring to post-1918 Romania as Great Romania or Greater Romania. And for all of you who don't follow this kind of stuff that closely, the term greater, when acting as the prefix to a country name, usually refers to that country's nationalists' vision for how big their country should be. It brings to mind names like Greater Serbia or Greater Germany, the state that Nazis tried to create during World War II. Calling the post-1918 state Greater Romania sounded like a passive-aggressive way of calling the interwar Romanian state an extreme nationalist construct, not a reflection of the will of its populace. So, what do I do now? Well, I'm a student. In fact, I'm a student at a university with a very good Eastern European history faculty, and one of my professors just wrote a book on Romania in the interwar years. Remember? I needed to ask him a few things anyway, so I went to his office hours. He didn't know who Laszlo Kurti was, but he assured me that referring to Romania post-1918 as Great Romania was not an indication of anything. In fact, it was the official name of the state at the time. Well, while I was there, I thought I might as well ask him about Lucian Boia, the Romanian author. And it turns out he knew him. He's interviewed him at his book launches. He confirmed to me that the book I'd been reading was a classic, but was also able to contextualize Boia's generalizations about Hungarian historiography. Boia apparently doesn't speak Hungarian. He can speak Romanian, English, and French, but not Hungarian, which consequently means that he can't access Hungarian texts unless they've been translated. I gotta be honest, that makes sense. It's easy to slip into generalizations if you can't physically access the literature you're describing. Boia, in fact, did nothing more than fall into the same trap I fell into at the start of this journey, scared and unsettled by having been misled by nationalist historians. Okay, he fell into it for different reasons than me, but to think of Hungarian historians or Romanian historians as rigid, homogeneous groups is a fool's errand, and the two authors that I had just read prove it. Boia and Kurti, despite figures of speech which translate poorly, both try to distance themselves from their own country's nationalist historiography. This is the danger of studies of nationalism. It invites one to think in terms of groups, of entities larger than the people which comprise them, when in fact these entities do not have any agency of their own, only the people which comprise them do. And those people are not all the same. In letting my own fear of being deceived move me to judge these authors by the linguistic origins of their names, I was just as guilty of generalizing as Boia was. Another professor of mine once told me that the three most important phrases for a historian to know are, "I don't know," "I was wrong," and "I changed my mind." Well, I was wrong. Even if not in my words, I was wrong in my unspoken assumptions. And I've changed my mind. The story of modern Transylvanian historiography is this. Within both countries, there are nationalist historiographical traditions, which, while not representing the entirety of their state's academia, are nonetheless present, and which have over the past been promoted by individual nationalist governments within these states that are fighting over... well, what exactly? It's a valid question. What is this argument about? Now, in our times. Kurti makes an observation here. Quote, "The situation of Transylvania, either as part of Romania after 1918 or Hungary during the period 1940 to 44, reveals that when military confrontations subsume and states resume diplomatic relations, territorial controversies do not wither away but assume newer forms. One such form, as shown above, has been played out not in direct political confrontation, but in intellectual and academic contexts between scholars and statesmen. Isn't that what took place after World War II as well? Territorial disputes not going away but changing forms, still present in the cultural and political imagination, still capable of mobilizing public support? But what would happen if support were roused? Like, what's the end case scenario? What are we playing at here? What would happen if suddenly, tomorrow, there was conclusive evidence that there was no Romanian presence in Transylvania when the Hungarians arrived in the Middle Ages? Lucian Boia provides a pretty good answer. Nothing would change. These historical exercises all miss the point. If we look to the past, to a specific point in time to justify modern political constructs, well, we could justify anything. So many peoples have migrated across so much of the world over so many centuries that if you say those people in the past are your people, you could place your people in control of a number of different-looking territorial constructs. Answering the question of whose land is this land by trying to find out who was there first is a fool's errand. And now, I want to quote Boya here, and this is a long quote, I've abridged it a bit, but it really captures what I think this is all about. Quote, "To the extent that not force, which can always find its justifications in history or elsewhere, but right is to decide, the past must give way before the realities of the present and the free expression of options. The rights of the Romanians in Transylvania are only supported in appearance by Dacians or Daco-Romans. However, they are supported effectively by the fact that the substantial majority of the population is Romanian, and that, if the occasion were to present itself, most inhabitants of the province would decisively affirm their belonging to Romania. In the event of an inversion of the numerical relation between ethnic groups in Transylvania, a phenomenon that has occurred in various parts of the world, the situation would be different. But who could pretend to return to the borders and ethnic proportions of hundreds of years ago? From this point of view, the question of Transylvania is settled. Hungarian or Romanian mythological exercises do not change anything. Transylvania is indisputably Romanian, just as it is also indisputable that a Hungarian minority live there, whose specific rights need to be recognized. Neither continuity nor immigrationism can alter the data of the problem one iota. In fighting against Hungarian immigrationism, Romanian historians have allowed themselves to be caught up in a race. Historical right was brought to the foreground, and, since nothing is certain and univocal in matters of historical right, a feeble and controversial argument ended up eclipsing the undeniable reality of the predominantly Romanian character of Transylvania, regardless of what might have happened 1,000 or 2,000 years ago." End quote. Couldn't have said it better myself. But then, what about the villagers Grete met some 25 years ago? They still remember their versions of history. Laszlo Kurti had located the part of society responsible for peddling these myths in the academic and political elite. Lucian Boya provided an argument for how Romanian academic elites were led down the wrong track, arguing about historical rights. But the arguments made by the villagers Grete had encountered linked the question of population continuity to the question of historical rights. For all their analysis of the theory, it appears Boya and Kurti forgot to draw the situation on the ground into account. When Grete had come to Transylvania, she had come worried that something like the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia could happen there. Well, I'm doing a class on Yugoslavia right now. I did my bachelor's thesis on Yugoslavia, and I can tell you that a lot of authors, whom I tend to agree with, see the propagation of Serb nationalism from circles within the Serbian academic elite towards the broader Serb public as one of the reasons for the violence which ensued. These academics' theories, in other words, have a nasty habit of motivating other people to political action later on down the line. Grete provides an example of this that happened in Transylvania. In 1994, Gheorghe Funar, the mayor of the Transylvanian town of Cluj and a Romanian nationalist, ordered archaeological excavations in the town square. It was believed that there may have been a Roman settlement there, the findings of which Funar hoped to be beneficent to his political beliefs. But to access the finds, the statue of a famous Hungarian king on the square would have had to have been removed. Ethnic Hungarians, including those in the villages Grete visited, were quick to sense an anti-Hungarian motivation in Funar's actions. In Grete's words, "When anything occurs in politics which appeals to these feelings of fear and distrust, two fronts are lined up in no time." So, what happened then? Well, I looked. I asked my professor in Dublin. He didn't know of any more recent studies. I looked some more. I asked my professor in Vienna. He recommended a different author, the anthropologist Rogers Brubaker. His most recent study was published in 2006 and painted an altogether different picture. The study focused on the city of Cluj and found that its ordinary citizens, both Romanians and Hungarians, largely disregarded the political polemic of politicians like Funar. Brubaker and his co-authors discovered that the lived experience of ethnic diversity for most of the town's residents was different, and in particular much less relevant to their day-to-day lives, than how it was cast by social elites. This too makes sense, of course. Just as we should watch out not to throw all Hungarian and Romanian historians into one basket because of their ethnicity, so we should not throw all Hungarian and Romanian citizens of Transylvania into one basket. It stands to reason that these groups would not have homogeneous beliefs, but represent a political spectrum in which nationalism is of varying importance based on the individual in question. Crucially, Brubaker highlights that intellectuals play a role in this as well, citing anthropologist Thomas Eriksson to say that, quote, "If one goes out to look for ethnicity, one will, quote-unquote, find it, and thereby contribute to constructing it," end quote. So, should we be wary of people like Gret van de Wever, who set out as a Western European anthropologist into an Eastern European region, bringing with her the assumption that the political salience of ethnicity that she had seen lead to disaster in neighboring Yugoslavia must also matter politically in Transylvania, simply because an ethnic minority exists there? Could she be doing more harm than good? On the other hand, van de Wever and Brubaker studied two very different settings. One 2 villages, one a city. Is it conceivable that both worlds coexist? That the question of ethnicity takes on a different role in the more confined setting of a village? That local factors completely unrelated to ethnicity could have contributed to the different outcomes observed by these two anthropologists? I can imagine that. But then again, I don't know it. And both of these studies are well over a decade old. Could things have changed in the meantime? Well, yes. So what now? Well, I could just let it go. That knowledge simply isn't accessible to me. I'd have to go there myself. I don't even speak the language or know where to start. But then again, can I let this one go?
141 to Budapest, Keleti. Scheduled departure time 8:42. We depart approximately...
This podcast was written, recorded, and edited by me, Coleman Marshik. The music was composed by Matthias Cantini, and all artwork was designed by Andrew Holt. I also want to give a special thanks for all of their help to Oliver Schmidt and Graham Murdoch. I'm sorry, I couldn't fit firmer in. It'll have to be another time.